Between the days of Moses and the era of the great kings, the judges led the people of Israel through the treacherous process of settling into a new land and making it into their own. These men and women, called by God from sometimes obscure or ignominious circumstances, were charged with the task of administering the nation in times of peace, and more often, leading the charge in times of war. Unlike the kings, the judges were not born into their roles. They were hand-picked by the Lord, typically in times of crisis, to turn the nation away from apostasy and deliver it from its oppressors. Their company comprises some of the most memorable figures in the Bible. People like wise Deborah, valiant Gideon, and the mighty Samson. But though their stories are often inspiring, a closer look at the judges reveals that most of these leaders had feet of clay, and some were such misfits that we might well wonder why God would have chosen them at all. These are not saintly figures like Joseph or Daniel, and yet their brokenness may well be part of their appeal. The Book of Judges stands as something of a crossroads in the Bible. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is dominated by the figure of Moses. Joshua, as Moses' protege, essentially continued that tradition, completing the work that Moses had begun. The age of Israel's kings and the towering figure of David still loom in the future. The period of the Judges forms a bridge between the crucial eras of Mosaic leadership and the era of monarchy. But the Book of Judges isn't simply a chronology of that interim era. In fact, it's not really a chronology at all. The stories here don't appear to be in chronological order. One of the last stories told in the book quite clearly happened near the beginning of the Judges era. It's possible that some of these stories told here actually overlapped in time, occurring in different regions of the land. So rather than being a chronology of the era, the Book of Judges appears to be more of an anthology, a collection of representative stories meant to provide us with an overview and a characterization of the era, rather than a blow-by-blow account of what happened. But it's not just a hodgepodge of materials drawn from various sources about Israel's past. It's a carefully constructed work of literature, designed to drive home some important lessons to a nation in turmoil. In this introduction to Judges, we're going to touch on a couple of important matters. One of those is the historical background of the text. When and how did the events described here occur? What is the political situation? What is Israelite society like in these days? Who are these enemies described in the book? What is their relationship to the fledgling Israelite nation? These are some of the questions that biblical scholars and archaeologists have been kicking around for the last century or so. Another significant aspect of this book is its literary character. As an anthology, the Book of Judges consists of a collection of stories that probably originated in various places and maybe circulated independently before they were finally assembled into a book of the Bible. What were the natures of the original stories? What literary devices had the authors employed, making their stories interesting and meaningful? Who assembled them into a book? How much of this book's message is the product of the original stories, and how much is the work of the editors who assembled it? There is yet another important aspect of this text, and that's its theological message, but we'll be saving that topic for another lecture. But for now, we do need to note that this book isn't designed primarily to fill our gaps about Israelite history. Its primary purpose is to tell us about Israel's relationship with God. Bearing this fact in mind will help us to avoid getting sidetracked into matters that the narrators didn't care to address. So let's start with the historical and cultural background. Scholars generally agree that the period of the Israelite monarchy began sometime around 1050 BC. So we can confidently state that the era of the Judges ended sometime around the turn of that first millennium BC. The question of when it begins, that's a bit more of a challenge. There are two major theories for dating the Exodus from Egypt. One says that the Exodus occurred around 1470 BC, which would mean the period of the Judges lasted about 400 years. The other theory is that the Exodus occurred around 1235 BC, which would put that era more like 200 years. Well, you say, why not just add up all the numbers for the Judges' lengths of administrations? See what we come up with. As we noted earlier, the book really isn't a chronology of the era. Undoubtedly, some of those administrations overlapped or occurred in different orders than those presented in the book, so the numbers really aren't going to help that much. All we can say with certainty is that Israel was led by judges for at least a couple hundred years before the time of the kings. Another matter of concern is the state of Israelite society in those days. A biblical scholar named Martin Noth advanced a theory several decades ago that Israel in those days was similar to archaic Greece in the sense that in Greece a group of cities or tribal groups would sometimes join together in patronage of a central shrine. This is an arrangement known as an Amphictyony, or sometimes called an Amphictyonic League. Noth speculated that the Israelites might have had a similar kind of association. A group of people bound together not actually by common ancestry so much as by their patronage of the tabernacle. While this theory hasn't found anything near universal acceptance, it would explain the Israelites' tendency to pull apart so easily, as if each tribe formed its own separate state rather than a cohesive nation. It foreshadows events to come later in Israel's history when the nation divides into two kingdoms. One of the questions that scholars have pondered is how this political picture differs from the picture presented in the book of Joshua. In Joshua, we see a united Israel, fighting as one against the inhabitants of the Promised Land. But in Judges, the Israelites seem almost as likely to fight against each other as they are to fight the Canaanites. But that's not the only issue that gives scholars pause. In Joshua, the conquest of Canaan is presented as rapid, decisive. Joshua 21:41 says, "Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to their fathers that he would give them. And having taken possession of it, they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side." But now compare that to Judges 3:1, where it stated, "These are the nations that the Lord left to test all those in Israel who had no experience of any war in Canaan." And then it goes on to list several nations. So now we might ask, which one was it? Was the conquest a massive invasion and overthrow of the existing culture, which Joshua seems to imply? Or was it an ongoing struggle, as it says in Judges? Archaeologists prefer the version that they see in the book of Judges. They point out that there really is no archaeological evidence of a sudden massive influx of millions of people into the land of Canaan anytime in the second half of the second millennium BC. They also say that they don't find evidence of widespread destruction that the book of Joshua seems to demand. On the other hand, a careful reading of Joshua indicates that the conquest wasn't necessarily characterized by massive destruction. Only a few cities were completely destroyed by Israel, and others were simply taken over and the present inhabitants pushed out. Nonetheless, it does seem apparent that the book of Joshua compresses events that occurred over a long period of time into a fairly short literary framework, while Judges spreads the events out and gives more of a real prolonged struggle between the native Canaanites and their incoming Israelites. Another interesting aspect of Judges' historical background concerns the people that the Israelites encounter in their new land. There are, of course, the Canaanites. In this era, the Canaanites weren't a nation per se. Rather, the land of Canaan was characterized by little city-states that were mostly dependent upon Egypt for trade and protection. Occasionally, one of these states would assert itself and take control of a larger region, but there was nothing like a Canaanite nation. On the other hand, some of the neighboring lands did have kings and governments in this era. The Midianites, for example, and the Moabites, they were apparently fairly well settled. Pharaoh Ramesses II lists Moab among the nations that he conquered on a statue that he had erected in Luxor. The Edomites were still mostly nomadic tribes in this period, though Genesis 36 does state that there were kings in Edom before they existed in Israel. The Philistines arrived in the land of Palestine maybe just a little later than the time when the Israelites did. Being technologically more advanced than their neighbors, they became one of the chief threats to the Israelites in their efforts to expand through the region. To the northwest, the Phoenician city-states of Tyre and Sidon were wealthy and willing trade partners, but they weren't a military threat to Israel. So Israel settled into a land that was divided and heavily contested by a number of peoples. And above all, the shadow of Egypt still lingered, because even when they weren't controlling the region de facto, the Egyptians still thought of Canaan as theirs. Now all of this political intrigue sets the stage for the literary complexity of the Book of Judges. Each of these stories originated in its own context. Each one forms a self-contained unit that could be told all by itself as an entertaining hero tale. But the way they've been assembled in this book, the way they form an ongoing narrative, clearly this is not merely an accident, but is a design. The composer has selected these stories and joined them together in a way that makes each case appear more desperate than the last. It's not just that Israel keeps choosing to do the wrong things. They grow egregiously more wicked through the course of the narrative, until our narrator puts a bow on the whole sordid mess with the laconic observation, "There was no king in Israel in those days. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." There's really no telling when the original stories of the people like Ehud and Deborah and Samson were first composed. But we're on a little firmer footing when we ask the question of how they got edited together into the Book of Judges. Now, don't get me wrong, like most of the Old Testament, the Book of Judges is anonymous. Traditionally, it was attributed to the prophet Samuel, who also happens to be the last of the judges. Nowadays, however, a new theory has replaced the traditional understanding and is gaining fairly wide acceptance. Today, most scholars believe that the Book of Judges was composed in a few stages by a person or persons known as the Deuteronomist. This theory, like the theory of the Amphictyonic League, originated with Martin Note, and it was modified by the Harvard scholar Frank Moore Cross. Note argued that Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings were composed during the Babylonian exile to explain the fall of Judah. When you think of it, here it is, a nation which believes that its God is the sole creator of heaven and earth, and that this God had chosen to dwell in Jerusalem. But now their nation was in captivity. Jerusalem and the temple of the Lord had been destroyed. You can imagine that could have resulted in quite a crisis of faith among the people of Judah. The Deuteronomistic history, it was argued, was composed to demonstrate that God had not failed his people. Rather, it was the people who had failed God. There's a good deal of evidence for this theory. First of all, there's the fact that Joshua through 2 Kings forms a fairly continuous story with several recurring central themes. Some of these themes are clearly derived from ideas presented in the Book of Deuteronomy, therefore we have this name Deuteronomistic history. The main idea here is that if Israel rejects the laws of the Lord and goes off to worship other gods, the Lord will punish them by giving their enemies victory over them. Ultimately, if Israel utterly refuses to obey, God will punish the nation by removing it from its land and sending it into exile, which is of course precisely what happened in the Babylonian exile. In 1968, Frank Moore Cross modified the Deuteronomistic hypothesis by proposing that the work was initially composed during the time of King Josiah to support his reform programs. It was then modified later during the Babylonian exile to reflect the new circumstances. This is called the double redaction theory of the Deuteronomistic history. Now, not all scholars have completely bought into the validity of this hypothesis, and the idea that the Book of Judges went through only 2 redactions is pretty much universally rejected. Most scholars believe it was quite a bit more complicated than that. Nonetheless, the idea that the text was substantially formed during the Babylonian exile seems quite secure. Each of these episodes drives home the idea of God's sovereignty, of human culpability, and of supernatural grace. The failures of Israel in these episodes parallel the failures that the nation experiences in its later history. Though Israel thoroughly earned God's judgment, God chose again and again to forgive his people, to discipline them and to deliver them from their oppressors. The Book of Judges serves as a beacon of hope to a people who have been conquered, humiliated, and subjugated by a pagan power. Their punishment had been well earned, but their God was abundantly merciful.